Hi, this is Mrs. Brown from Research Triangle High School. The purpose of this presentation is to talk to you a little bit about the Canterbury Tales, to give you an overview of what we mean when we say the Canterbury Tales and something about Geoffrey Chaucer, the author, as well. I want you to hear a little bit of what the prologue would sound like in the original Middle English that it would have been spoken in. So that's just a little taste of what Middle English would have sounded like, and we're going to take a look at the Canterbury Tales in a little more detail now. So maybe one way to start thinking about the Canterbury Tales is to think about yourself and some dreams that you may have had for travel. Is there some place that you've always wanted to visit before you died? Do you have a bucket list of places to go? It's maybe a landmark that you want to see, or maybe even a person you want to meet, or that kind of a once-in-a-lifetime trip, because that's what this trip would have meant for the pilgrims who were going to Canterbury. So who was Geoffrey Chaucer, the author of these things we call the Canterbury Tales? Well, we actually know quite a bit about him. We know that he was the son of a vintner, and that meant that his dad made wine. Think about vin is V-I-N is actually the French word for wine, and you get that sense of vine where the grapes grow. We know that Chaucer, throughout his lifetime, held several civil service positions. He was kind of a politician, helped out in the town and the community. We know that he was very well traveled throughout that area. We know that he read fluently in English, Latin, Italian, and French, and that within his lifetime he was actually kind of a rock star. His works were very popular, and he was invited a lot of places, and everyone knew who he was. And he was particularly praised for making English suitable for poetry, because up until this time most poems and things would have been in the original Latin or perhaps in French, but he used the language of the people, the vernacular, and which was Middle English at that time, to create these stories of these people who were traveling. So the Canterbury Tales themselves, we know that Chaucer started writing them around 1386, and that he planned to write 120 different versions, 120 different stories, and that he actually completed 22, and then we have fragments of a couple that didn't quite get finished. There's still 80 original manuscripts. Now remember, this is before the printing press would have come in, so all the copies that we have of the Canterbury Tales would have been hand copied, and there's 80 of them that have survived through to today, and most of them obviously are in the hands of museums. And the most highly decorated one was something called the Ellesmere manuscript. And any of the pictures that you'll see throughout this unit probably come from Ellesmere. This was a very particularly calligraphied and illustrated, in other words, all these designs and decorations and pictures to go along with the actual stories. And that the stories themselves were huge different genres. There were lots of different things. The general prologue is what's called an estate satire, where Geoffrey Chaucer is telling us about all the different positions in society that these people came from, and that the pilgrimage itself becomes the framing device for telling all these individual stories. It has this sort of conventional springtime opening, when that April with the shora sota, that's saying that when in April with the showers sweet, so it starts in the spring, and that the tales were supposed to be for ernst and game, in other words, for instruction, to teach lessons, but also just for entertainment. Now you'll hear us talk about this idea of the pilgrims and the pilgrimage. Now what are we talking about? Well, most of you know the term pilgrim from the people who came to the United States. Of course, it wasn't the United States then, but who sailed over on the Mayflower and landed at Plymouth Rock. But what a pilgrim is someone who is going on a journey. They're taking a travel or a trip for a really specific purpose. Pilgrims would often travel to Rome or to Jerusalem to visit the Holy Lands. And in this case, these pilgrims are on their way to the Canterbury Cathedral. That's why these are called the Canterbury Tales. And the Canterbury Cathedral became a shrine to Thomas a Becket. If you remember, Thomas a Becket was this holy man who was murdered because he wasn't supporting King Henry at the time. And why would you go on pilgrimage? Well, there are a couple of different reasons. Lots of people make pilgrimages. In this case, they were going because they thought they might get a heavenly reward. In other words, if you take a difficult journey to a holy land, that you would get some sort of a free pass from God for something. They might be doing it as penance. Maybe they'd done something wrong, and this is going to be their walk or their travel to kind of cleanse themselves and make it right again. And some of them just went because there was a lot of good beer along the way. In other words, they would just travel with a group and go on this pilgrimage because it was a good excuse to stop at every town along the route, and every town would have a pub and you'd have a chance to stop and meet people. So a lot of the same reasons that people would make travels and journeys today. And then people would often go in groups simply for safety. Travelers on the road were very likely to be attacked by bandits. It was hard to get out of the mud if you got stuck. You didn't have other people to help you push. So the group was to provide safety and to go with a group there and companionship along the way to Canterbury. So Geoffrey Chaucer begins the Canterbury Tales with something called the prologue. And the prologue sets up this frame that introduces the reader to all of the people who were going on this trip to Canterbury Cathedral. And in this prologue, Chaucer tells us a little bit about the three estates. And this is the way medieval society was divided. So there were the people who worked for a living, the people who fought for a living, and the people who prayed for a living. And those are considered to be the three estates, and every job would fall into one of these categories. Now, the third estate, which was on the lowest rung there, that had the least amount of social or political power and the least amount of money, would have been the workers. And that starts from out and out slaves, and then going up to the serfs, the peasants, and then maybe some small farmers. And later on, the rising middle class would produce some workers in the form of tradesmen, artisans, and merchants. Now, the second estate was known as the fighters, and these are the people who did these jobs of protecting everyone else. And they started in rank again with the soldiers, then moving up to the knights, and then you would have lords, those who might fight and rule. So they might be knighted and be trained in battle, but they might also own land and control land, which brings us up to the nobility and to the kings. So notice that even the king was only a part of the second estate. The king was still considered to be a warrior, a fighter leader. And sometimes aristocrats in particular would enter the clergy and move from the second estate into the first estate, and it almost never happened the other way around with the lowest rung moving in. But sometimes someone who was from the second estate might decide to join the church and become a member of the first estate, which is our next slide. Now, because of the importance of the church in this time period, even the lowest person in this class, with the prayers, who we had those who work, those who fight, and those who pray, would have been considered a higher estate, even though they wouldn't have had as much social or political clout. And so that means anybody who is working in the church starts with the local village priests, the nuns who have taken a vow and joined a convent, the monks, the people who help to run the convents, the prioress and abbess, the people in charge of the church, like the deacons and the friars and the parsons, etc., all the way up to the Pope. Okay, so if we know that in this time period men were classified according to the work that they did, how were women fit into all of this? Well, women were classified either by the estate they were first born into, so in other words, who your daddy was, and then you could actually change your state either by marrying someone or by joining the church. There were also considered to be three feminine estates, and those are virgins, women who had never been married, wives, people who were currently married, and widows, people who used to be married. So a woman was categorized not so much by her profession or by her accomplishment, but basically by the men in her life, who she's sleeping with right now, who she used to sleep with, or who she's never slept with. Now, maybe the most important thing about this time period were these emerging middle class. And these are the estates that are still workers, but they don't necessarily have to own land or be working for someone else who owns lands. They have something they can do on their own to generate income. And these would be the merchants who traded things back and forth, the tradesmen themselves who did stuff, scholars who were starting to become able to teach at universities and research and write things down, sailors or traders, new medicine arising with doctors, and finally the artists. So Chaucer's prologue takes great care to introduce us to all of these people who are on this voyage to Canterbury. And in his descriptions, he shows you their social rank or their estate. So are they a worker, a prayer, or a fighter? tells you something about their moral or spiritual condition, whether they're honest people or whether they're cheating, something about who they are in terms of their morality. And then often includes a lot of the others, the physiognomy, which is what they look like, their clothes, their work, their hobbies, their food, and then their humor. And by humor here, we don't mean humor as in whether or not they were funny, but we're going to talk about this on an upcoming slide. So as we've talked about in class, the people from this time had a very limited understanding of medical ideas, like how the body actually worked and how diseases were transmitted. But one of the thoughts that they had was that people were controlled by the liquid that was inside of them. And they identified these 4 humors. And again, it doesn't have anything to do with funny. These would be 4 forms of liquid. And the first was black bile that's produced by the liver. And if you had a lot of black bile, or if your humors weren't in balance, you would have these kinds of personality traits. So black bile was associated with the cold and dry, with the earth. On the positive side, someone who had a black bile as their dominant fluid might be very thoughtful or creative or artistic. And on the negative side, they might be a little too despondent or sleepless or depressed. If the humor that kind of was ruling in you was blood was associated with things that were hot and moist. But on the positive side, that would mean, think about like if your face gets really red, that it could be very cheerful and even-tempered and confident and romantic, or on the negative, that you might be really unrealistic or unaccomplished in some way. The other 2 fluids that could rule a person's personality were yellow bile and phlegm. And yellow bile was also this thought that was produced by the liver. Again, they didn't really quite understand how bodies worked, but they were trying to figure something out. So if you had a lot of yellow bile, it was associated with hot and dry characteristics. On the positive side, yellow bile people would have a lot of leadership and action and decision making. But on the negative side, they'd be very easily angered, maybe even mean-spirited or suspicious. And then phlegm. Phlegm is all that stuff that you have. And that you can even just sort of think about it. Somebody who had too much phlegm is sort of cold and moist. On the positive side, they might be the calm, content, rational. But on the negative, they might be sort of unemotional, lazy, or even cold. So to summarize, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales are the story of all of these people who decided to go together on this pilgrimage to Canterbury. And in the middle of the prologue and the rest of the stories, he's also going to tell us something about all of these people's characteristics, what estate they belonged to, what they looked like, and possibly something about their dominant humor to tell you something about their personality. And we're going to be starting on the Canterbury Tales in just another class.